Right, hi everyone. I am Mikaela and I work for Cleanaway's sustainability team in New South Wales. And like was mentioned today, I want to talk with you guys around engaging with communities when we are introducing novel waste streams. So I'm sure everyone here is more than aware about the pretty severe environmental, social and economic impacts of waste. So the majority of our focus these days is around trying to divert waste away from landfill, with the most common way of doing this by introducing recycling streams. But I'm sure as well we're all more than aware that trying to introduce recycling streams into public spaces is more often than not fraught with problems. Some of these problems include how to actually set up your recycling stream so that it achieves the results that we're actually after, so that we achieve high recycling rates. A lack of data to actually monitor our progress as well is a pretty big issue a lot of the times. Contamination, recycling streams in public places are always often fairly contaminated. And then also one of the more recent ones is the kind of public sentiment around recycling and that kind of attitude towards it being all just too hard. And one of the reasons that it's all kind of a little bit too hard is that recycling in a lot of the time in public spaces and across businesses is actually a bit confusing. They kind of have a point. So this is an example of a range of different public space bins, recycling bins and just normal waste bins, and you can see that there's just no uniformity from one area to the next. The variety is kind of a bit crazy when you look at it. And oftentimes the bin design is driven more by aesthetics than functionality. And ultimately this lack of consistency across different businesses, different council areas, different cities, it makes providing a consistent and coherent message around what is and what is not recyclable really difficult. And it really doesn't help the kind of overall confusion that a lot of people face. We've heard it already a couple of times today, but China sword has really added to the confusion and that kind of growing issue publicly with recycling. And it has, had a pretty decent impact on what we are able to recover and actually recycle in the industry. So that's changed the waste streams and what can and can't now be recycled in your curbside recycling stream or through your local MRF. And there's also this growing apathy towards recycling. The public perception is driven a lot of the times by the media. So, I feel like recently, particularly, there's been almost, weekly stories about the recycling crisis. And again, we've already had it mentioned a couple of times today, but the recent 60 Minutes expose about recycling, I don't think I really need to go into that with everyone today. And I quickly did a Google search when I was putting this presentation together, just purely searching recycling in the same sentence. And under the people also search little box there were the following. So firstly, is there recycling in Australia? Does Australia still recycle? And what can we recycle in Australia? So I think overall that confusion out there in the public is pretty strong and pretty prevalent, and it doesn't really make our jobs any easier when it comes to trying to get people to recycle or to introduce recycling streams into public spaces, particularly when it's a new stream. When it's a novel stream, it's not just your commingle and your general waste, it's your food waste or your soft plastics recycling. It can be really tough. So I want to talk to you guys about a bit of a case study and a project that I've been working on with Jamboree Action Park over the past probably 5-6 months now. And Jamboree Action Park is down just outside of Wollongong. It's a water recreation park, and they, in their high season, so in the peak of summer, they can have anywhere from upwards of 5,000 people a day visiting their park. So they get a lot of people coming through, and historically they've had a really tough time with their waste management. So they do have recycling bins next to their general waste stations across the park. I think they've got around about 80 stations in total. But historically, due to contamination, effectively everything from those bins was going straight to landfill. Now, I will kind of preface, I was really hoping to be able to get up here today and talk you guys through a completed case study from start to finish, but unfortunately, time wasn't quite on my side with this one, and the park is now closed down just for their off-season. So while I don't have a completed case study to talk you guys through, I am going to just go into a little bit of the process that we've gone through so far and the learnings and the challenges that we've actually had and how we are going to approach them moving forward when they open back up in the spring. So when I first started working with Jamberoo Action Park, we conducted a bin trim for them. So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the bin trim program, but effectively it's just a EPA-led program. It's an initiative that's funded through the Waste Less, Recycle More funding, and it funds consultancies to go out and work with businesses to increase diversion and increase their recycling on site. So we went ahead and we did this assessment for Jamberoo Action Park, and what we really identified overall was that the majority of their packaging was either food packaging or CDS eligible containers. Other than that, there wasn't a lot of other kind of waste that was being generated on site. Also, we did kind of identify, you can see a picture of their signage there, that it wasn't the greatest. It was a little bit old, and it clearly wasn't affecting the outcome that they were hoping to achieve with their recycling. And Jamberoo, they did want to be fairly ambitious when it came to changing up their waste streams and to achieving higher recycling on site. And so, keeping in mind what their waste was actually comprised of, we decided to change their streams by changing their commingle from accepting all commingle materials to just purely bottles and cans, since that was the majority of their commingle that was actually being generated. And then the remainder of the waste is food packaging or food, so we thought that it was pretty logical to introduce a food waste bin down in that area as well. Their local organics facility can accept a pretty wide range of compostable packaging, so it seemed to be kind of the best fit for what they were wanting to achieve. So they went ahead and they made some changes on site. They introduced new bin stations. They wanted to kind of do the whole clear bin thing for their bottles and cans to kind of highlight what was going in, and while there wasn't any clear bins available to them, they compromised and put a see-through grate in there. And they introduced food waste bins as well. They adhered to national colour standards for all their waste streams, and their signage reflects best practice when it comes to bin signage design. So just a couple of icons and a few words. They also went ahead and changed all of their packaging that was generated in their canteen area, so the Bombora seafood area, to compostable, so that everything that they were handing out from that canteen would be able to go in that food waste bin. So ideally they should have had pretty much most of their waste going to the food waste bin, bottles and cans in the commingle, and then just residual items going into their general waste, as patrons to the park do actually bring in their own items as well. So there would still be some packaging and items that wouldn't be able to be either composted or go in the bottles and cans bin. So far, so good, sounding like they're doing absolutely everything right. But a few months in, when I double-checked with them to see how everything was actually going, the feedback was that it just wasn't working as well as they had hoped. There was pretty high contamination of their bottles and cans stream, and that they still had pretty high general waste, so they weren't getting as much of the compostable packaging actually going in their food waste stream. So one Saturday I went down to the park and I spent the majority of the day just collecting a bit of data, watching people as they were throwing away their waste, and also having a few conversations with people once they'd disposed of their waste to kind of understand what their reasonings were. And there were a couple of observations there. So from what I observed on the day, 2/3 of people were incorrectly disposing of their waste. And surprisingly, kind of on the flip side there, their food waste had really low contamination. So their contamination rate was less than 5% from what I could see in their food waste bin. So completely within the allowable threshold for the facility that it's going to, but just that massive loss of resources through to general waste. And so after speaking with some people following disposal of their waste, there were kind of two key reasons why this was occurring. The first one just was lack of knowledge. So the overwhelming response that I got from people was that they had no idea that the packaging that they were purchasing and throwing away was compostable. Being a novel waste stream in that area, they're not as used to food waste systems or compostable packaging as you might be, in the middle of Sydney City where it's everywhere now. So there was a lack of familiarity with the items and with the waste stream. There was also a little bit of hesitation from some people who actually did probably pick up that it was compostable packaging, but then they weren't familiar enough with the actual service to know that they could put it in that service. So they took the more cautious approach of putting it into general waste instead, which, it does make sense. And then there was also a little bit of a lack of understanding of the difference between recyclable and compostable. So even when I did, speak to someone as they're about to throw out their waste and point out that what they had was compostable, they still then went to put it in the yellow bottles and cans waste stream. So just overall a bit of a lack of education. And then there were also the psychological barriers there of it doesn't get recycled anyway, or it's all too hard, so we're not going to bother. So to solve these problems for Jamberoo Action Park, we really needed to kind of address the gap of knowledge and that kind of culture gap as well between recycling. Again, it's a little easier said than done. So looking at the approach of how to solve these issues, the one thing that kept resonating with me was the fact that effectively what we were asking people to do by composting their food and their food packaging was we're asking them to adopt an innovation. So an innovation is an idea, a practice, or an object that is perceived as new to an individual. And that's exactly what it was. Putting a food waste stream into a public space where they don't really have knowledge of it, they haven't really experienced using it before, is new to them. So it's a completely new idea and not one that they're familiar with. So diffusion of innovation theory is basically a framework on how to get people to adopt a new idea or an innovation. It's a communication theory used quite a bit in marketing and education and also kind of public health strategies. So that is felt fairly relevant to me in this situation. So I won't go into it too much about the theory, but basically there are 5 main stages that people go through when they are deciding whether or not to adopt an innovation. The first one there is knowledge or awareness. There's persuasion, a decision stage, a stage where they implement their knowledge, and then also the final stage, which is confirmation or adoption of the innovation. Now, for our purposes, the 2 stages where I believe that we have the most influence on the public or on people coming into our businesses or council areas is to do with knowledge and persuasion. That's basically where we're going to get in front of the individuals and give them the information they need to either say, yep, we're going to get on board with this idea or this new waste stream, or no, we're not going to. So knowledge, sorry, just to kind of go over that. So knowledge is just, people can't, participate in an innovation or an idea if they don't know it exists. So the thing that comes to mind there with Jamberoo is that people didn't know the items were compostable, so how can you expect them to put that in the right bin if they don't know what it is in the first place? And persuasion is just ensuring that we are giving people the right or enough of the right information so that they make the decision that we're hoping for them to make. So knowledge transfer, the mechanisms that we normally have at our disposal to raise awareness are, your signage, so your bin signage. You have online, so your websites, council websites, business websites. You've got social media, and then you've got face-to-face. So signage is a pretty common one, but oftentimes it is fairly highly dependent on familiarity with that signage. If people aren't familiar with it, then it's harder for them to understand what you're trying to get them to do. Online information and social media is great because it's quick, easy access to the information you're trying to get across, but then on the downside, you don't often get across all the demographic that you're trying to reach. And then face-to-face is the best option, but oftentimes the least feasible as well. Now, there's a lot of information on best practice for how to do all of these things well and do it right. Again, I'm not going to go into that today, but the kind of key messages across all best practice is essentially you want to keep it simple and accessible for people. You want to ensure that the message is consistent, and it's also providing a clear directive. And then you also want to use multiple methods of communication as well. With Jamboree, simply having signage up was not enough to get that message across. You need multiple interventions in order to get people to understand or raise awareness of that innovation or that new system. And persuasion, so this is where people now know about the innovation and they're persuaded to seek out a little bit more information on it. And when we are trying to give them more information, there are a few factors of influence that we want to focus on. So the kind of key ones there are relative advantage of the innovation. So why is it better than what the system was before? Why is now having a food waste stream in the park better than just having the recycling and general waste stream that they had previously? And this is obviously, we know that it is environmentally, economically, socially better to recycle more, and waste as a resource is a great way of kind of encapsulating that when we're trying to say why it's actually better. Compatibility of the innovation. So is it consistent with the individual's values? And this is where we want to kind of leverage the social norms. People are a lot more likely to adopt a new behaviour or an innovation if they think that it is socially accepted or it's a social norm. And this is where we can also, specifically with food waste, talk about how FOGO is becoming a lot more common, not just in, say, New South Wales, but across the board. Okay, running out of time. And complexity, how difficult is it to understand the innovation? So simplicity is key here, and addressing. So there's one thing when it comes to behaviours and the difference between recyclers and non-recyclers, and it really came down to an attitude of perceived inconvenience. So if people think something is inconvenient and they're not really that inclined to recycle, there's no way you're going to get them to do it. So with this in mind, we are applying all this to Jamboree by really looking at their signage. And I'm not talking about bin signage here. I'm talking about because they don't know the items are compostable, we need to ensure we're raising awareness about that. So having posters at point of purchase when they're buying these products, and also at entry onto park. I don't think there's too much information that you can put out there when it comes to highlighting items like this. Online, we're going to get them to promote this online. So they have a website, and there's no reason they can't be, spruiking their waste management ambitions on there. And also an idea which they're still kind of mulling over, but having that information on their online tickets. So instead of the big disclaimers down the bottom that nobody ever reads, putting something there that's highlighting the fact that now on site they have all compostable packaging that can go in a food waste bin. We're also hoping to do a little bit of face-to-face engagement, so just a pop-up activity to really launch this new waste stream. Again, just as many touch points as possible to raise awareness about what the park is trying to do. And also I'm hoping that they're going to try to get their staff, when they're actually handing over the compostable packaging or food items to people, to say, just don't forget this is compostable, can go in our new food waste bin. So little touches like that can really help raise awareness and get that knowledge across to people. And then kind of encouraging that culture change, just touching on why it's actually important, not only to the business but also to the community. I'll just kind of skip through. Now, I was hoping to touch on Mikaela Festival. They have done some really awesome stuff when it comes to their waste management. I don't think I've got time to go over it now, but if you do want a little bit more information, do feel free to come see me. But ultimately, they've managed, by kind of applying some of the similar principles, of achieving 98% diversion of waste from landfill. So 2% of their waste is currently going to landfill, which I think is just amazing. And they did a lot of that through raising awareness and educating people as they're coming into the festival. And just kind of to wrap this all up for you guys, to summarise the kind of key things we want to take away when we are looking to introduce novel recycling streams into public spaces is to raise awareness. We need to educate people as effectively as possible, so use multiple intervention methods, multiple ways of raising awareness, and also ensure that the message that you're putting across is consistent across all those mediums. We want to promote the benefits, the compatibility and the complexity or the simplicity of the systems that you're trying to get people to adopt. You want to avoid that one-size-fits-all approach. Every single place is unique, so whether you're a business or a council area, the space you're trying to introduce these new systems to are unique, and they'll have their own set of challenges depending on the people that you're trying to encourage. Change is hard work. With the Mikaela example, it took them the best part of 4 or 5 years to get to the stage of 98% diversion. It doesn't happen overnight, and it is something that takes a little bit of time to get that change culturally across the public. And then also monitor and adjust. So if something's not working, look at it, see how you can adjust it. Don't expect just to set it up and it will all work perfectly. With Jamboree, they set it up according to the best practices that they were aware of, and if they had just left it, they would have gotten rid of this a couple of months ago because they weren't sure how to move forward. They weren't monitoring or adjusting it. So keep an eye on how it's all going and monitor, adjust as needed. And that's kind of it. I think I'm out of time.